There we go. I think we should be recording for just one moment. There we go. So hi, everyone. My name is Tommaso. I'm the president of the Politics and International Relations Society here at the University of Kent. This is our last event this term on U.S. politics and the Biden presidency. We are joined by an all-star panel of academics on American politics. We've got Professor Jonathan Bell from UCL. He's a professor in U.S. history and the head of department there. Dr. Claudia Harrington from De Montfort University, who is a professor in American politics there. Dr. Scott Lucas, who's a professor of American studies at the University of Birmingham and the founder and editor of EA Worldview. And Dr. Andrew Rowe from here at the University of Kent. And he's a professor of American politics and the chair of the Political Studies Association, Political Studies Association American Politics Group. So we'll start off by talking about the Biden presidency and what we expect from it, and then move on to the legacy of the Trump presidency. If I could start with you, Dr. Harrington, how much should we expect from the Biden presidency to be a continuation of Obama's presidency, both in policy and also in sort of the tactics for passing legislation?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me okay now with my headphones in? We all good?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Okay, thank you so much. And thanks for organizing this. Much appreciated. And it's nice to see colleagues, albeit in a two-dimensional format. So, yeah, I guess it's not going to be an Obama third term, nor should it be. There have been complaints, I suppose, already in terms of the some of the choices and some of the names being kind of bandied around for the top jobs. Oh, this is just more of the same old, etc. I wouldn't really buy into that, in the sense that, at a time of extreme crisis, such as is the case now between the public health crisis and the economic meltdown that comes with it, I think some steady hands at the tiller are not a bad thing. I was personally pretty pleased to see John Kerry appointed, or to be appointed, as the climate czar, or whatever the title might be. So I think maybe if you were on the left of the Democrat Party, you might be rolling your eyes and going, oh God, look, just more old white guys, what are we doing here? But on the other hand, considering the 74 million people that, voted for the other old white guy, there might be maybe some comfort in seeing something of a kind of a centrist approach from the party in power, or from those in the executive at least. And maybe there is more scope for kind of outreach to those across the that's Scott's hand, those across the aisle, in terms of trying to find some common ground, and not have sort of lurched so far to the left that there's just nothing and tumbleweed in the center. So I mean, there's loads to say on this, but I'll leave it at that, and we can sort of come back to anything that anybody wants to talk about as we go on.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And Professor Bell, if I could turn to you, as Dr. Harrington was mentioning, there is sort of multiple wings of the Democratic Party that Joe Biden needs to contest with as he starts his presidency. How do you see him dealing with sort of the more left-wing wing of the party that has emerged in the past 4 years, as well as sort of the grassroots activists that have emerged as a result of the Trump presidency?
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens in Georgia in the new year, because if, as is probably likely, the Democrats don't win 2 Senate seats that they need to have a tie that they can break in the Senate, that is always going to be the easy way out for a Biden presidency, to keep that slightly kind of energized left flank since the midterms, saying we can't do half of what you want because it's never going to go anywhere. Of course, the left flank of the Democratic Party, who are feeling quite bullish, not only having enlarged their ranks in the House, but they can also claim that all of them, including Medicare for all advocates in more vulnerable districts like Katie Porter in California, all were re-elected, and it was moderates who tended to be defeated. They're saying, we're not going to win the midterms of 2022 if we don't do something quite interesting to actually make relevant, given the fact that we only just squeezed back into control of the House and there were 74 million people still voting for the Republicans, despite you know, an appalling administration, at least on their terms. So I think the dilemma is, what is he going to do about them if, you know, if the Senate does become more contentious after Georgia in January, then it's going to be quite interesting. But I think at the moment, how are they going to get any of this stuff? They're already debating whether the progressive wing of the Democrats in the House have already been debating whether they should force a floor vote in exchange for accepting Pelosi as speaker again, and that's already dividing them on, do we start pushing stuff just to get a marker down as we go towards 2022 and then beyond, or is this just pointless gesture politics that there's no point to it? And of course they can't agree among themselves at the moment about that.
Right, and Dr. Rowe, if I could now turn to you. There is sort of a question, as Professor Bell was mentioning, about the Georgia runoffs and the power in the Senate. And regardless if Democrats win the Georgia runoffs, the Senate is a more center-right institution, which is likely to be more opposed to any of Joe Biden's policy proposals. How do you see him dealing with that in legislation, and how do you see him using the power of the executive branch? I'm sorry, I think you're still muted. If you could just tap the button. Thank you.
Sorry, when you say a centre-right institution, what do you mean?
Just that the makeup of the 100 senators tends to be more center-right, and even in the Democratic Party, you have senators like Joe Manchin, who are more towards the right or the center of the spectrum, and there's less of a strong and vocal left wing of the party in the Senate. Okay.
I mean, it's very difficult to know how he's going to play it because we don't know what the Senate's going to look like. You know, if it's going to be 50-50 with Kamala Harris having the casting vote, that puts him in a very different position than if it's, you know, 52-48. So, you know, as Jonathan Bell was suggesting, you know, that is just so important to how Biden plays this politically. Yeah, I think that he's got more experience than Obama had. You know, Obama was in the Senate for 4 years before he became president. Biden, I think, had nearly 4 decades. I think 36 years, something like that. I mean, you know, he was there a long time, and he knows how the Senate works. You know, he's used to building bridges. He's used to building coalitions. He's used to striking deals. So, you know, he's got so much experience. That I think will help him. But at the same time, you know, Obama didn't have the experience, but he had a much healthier majority than Biden's going to have. So he was, in some ways, he was in a much better position than Biden. You know, Obama tried to play bipartisanship. You know, he tried to reach across the aisle. And it didn't work. You know, the Republicans just killed him. You know, he was really struggled, you know, on judges, for example. You know, I mean, it's he didn't win that battle. And a lot of people on the left were saying, no, you can't play bipartisan politics with Republicans in Congress. You've got to play hardball. You know, Biden might face the same. I think will face the same problem. Although, you know, he is by nature a centrist, a pragmatist, a conciliator, a coalition builder with huge experience in the Senate. The Republicans are not going to play ball. I don't think it's going to be really tough for Biden. You know, and if you know the Senate blocks his main policy proposals, he'll have to go the executive route, and that can only take you so far.
Right, and if I could turn to Dr. Lucas now, there's sort of been this shift in how the Senate operates that Dr. Rowe was alluding to, with the Obama presidency and Mitch McConnell taking somewhat of an obstructionist approach. How much can Joe Biden do through executive action? how much can he just focus on foreign policy, for example? How can he get around these obstructions in the Senate when, as Dr. O was saying, they won't play ball in areas such as judges nominations?
I think that's a great point you raise, Tommaso, and I think I've got a slightly different entry point on this than the way we might normally read the situation for two factors, one of which you raised. The first is we're in a particular situation. We're in a crisis situation in a pandemic which has killed more than 300,000 Americans, which is projected to kill more than 500,000 by April the 1st. The vaccines are coming online, but you need a competent government to oversee vaccine distribution and other measures to contain the pandemic. We're in a crisis situation, regarding the economy and the effect of the economy from the pandemic. That's going to have to be dealt with. We have knock-on effects, social effects, we have environmental effects because of the developments that have happened in the past year. And that puts the Biden administration in a position not of playing ideology and not of playing ideological politics versus the Republicans, but of getting things done. In other words, we're talking about valence politics. I think the second thing linked to that, which you've raised, is that, yes, of course, at some points you need to get bills through Congress. We're going to have an immediate scrap, possibly, either before or just after Donald Trump leaves office over the National Defense Authorization Act, which he's threatened to veto. We'll then have government budgets to talk about. But a lot of this can be done by executive orders or just by simply being the adults in the room. So the federal government can coordinate state and local efforts to deal with coronavirus, for example. Executive orders means that Biden can shore up Obamacare without having to go through Congress. Executive orders mean you can bring back some of the environmental regulations that Donald Trump has stripped. You can protect the dreamers from deportation who have been threatened by Trump. You can rejoin the World Health Organization. You can make signs that you may want to re-enter the Paris Accords. Whether or not that can be done immediately, it's a question, but at least you can make signs that we're coming back into the international community on climate. All of that is there and does not require Mitch McConnell to be on board with you. But that being said, we already have a sign of a shift which is taking place now. And that is Mitch McConnell yesterday, of course, finally distanced himself from Donald Trump by recognizing Biden. But I think the equally important event is that by the end of the evening, McConnell had lifted his block on a coronavirus relief package. He was working with and not against Chuck Schumer, the Senate minority leader, and Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, as well as the House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy. Now, will McConnell continue to work with that? Well, we don't know. But what we realize is, and again, there's a historical precedent here. When Obama entered office in 2009, coming in the midst of the Great Recession after the financial crash, there was a need to get a stimulus package organized. And you had to work with the other party to get that out there, and that was done. Obama got Obamacare through. Now, McConnell made his life hell for the remaining 7 years, but Obamacare did go through. So I think there's 2 points we always look at, and they're there, but I think given this particular situation, we need to see what might be possible, the art of the possible. The first is the media love to play up progressives versus moderates, left versus right, because they love to play up the idea that the Democratic Party is going to implode. It makes for good headlines. And we know that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has issues with the Democratic National Committee over the way that the campaign was run. We know there's questions about how you approach Medicare for all. But I think that you're going to see a lot of the Democrats, especially in the Senate, realize we need to be in a position to get things done and not fall prey to ideological scraps. And the second point is Mitch McConnell's got a big choice because Mitch McConnell faces an immediate problem, which I just came off air discussing today with a radio station, which is he's got the Trumpies within the Republican Party. He's got that Trumpist faction. So he's got to deal with them. And secondly, if he decides to give problems to the Biden administration, how does he avoid looking like the obstructionist and taking the blame for it? I think both of those factors are going to limit this idea of that everything will just gridlock even before we get into the first few days of the Biden administration.
Right, and Joe Biden coming in will sort of have three areas to deal with: the rollback of Trump policies that he finds wrong or egregious, the fixing of the pandemic and the economic consequences of that, and then just his long-term policy goals that he articulated at the beginning of his campaign. If I could turn back to you, Dr. Harrington, how is he going to balance these three priorities in legislation and just overall in his presidency?
Now there's a question. Again, it obviously one would need something of a crystal ball, going back to what Andy was saying about, how things are going to play out in the Senate. So there is that. In terms of rolling back what came before, I think looking at the damage that Trump has done, it's sort of you could maybe categorize it in there's the kind of the substantial damage, and there's the, maybe not the style, but the surrounding damage, if you like, in terms of things like, reputation and sort of bashing democratic norms and all of that kind of stuff. So I think there's maybe kind of two levels in relation to the rollback, and one is just the idea of the adults coming back into the room, the thinking about reaching out to countries that have been a bit nonplussed at best by the past 4 years. Horrified to nonplussed, depending on who you ask. There's some recovery, I think, to be done there for sure. And I think the Biden-Harris ticket seem to be well placed to do it, just from the language that they've used already. Their rhetoric has been very kind of positive, constructive, really quite the opposite of what's come before. There are things that I've been thinking about in terms of, they have these crises to deal with, as you mentioned, the pandemic and the economic situation. And there are other things as well at play, like what do they do about possibly, the prosecution of Trump or not? That's something to be considered, in the sense that there are some rather tricky and unpleasant outstanding aspects to Trump's behavior that have not been put to bed yet. Now, I don't imagine Biden wants to fall down that rabbit hole instantly and get sort of caught up with all of that, because it would be a media circus, etc. But on the other hand, the idea that the rollback and the responses would just be purely about sort of policy and practical stuff, there's more to it than that. And I think it will be interesting to see how they handle it. Maybe it'll just be a case of, Cyrus Vance in New York working out his the kind of the more financial, or the focus on the more financial irregularities in relation to Trump. But there's the bigger stuff as well. There's the stuff to do with Robert Mueller. There are things that are not kind of put to bed yet. So I'll be very curious to see, to me, there's kind of layers of rollback and pushback, and we'll just kind of have to wait and see what the Biden-Harris team prioritize. They're going to have their hands very full, I think, probably just with the economy and just with COVID and the vaccine management stuff. That's the kind of the firefighting approach, I suppose, for the moment.
Right, brilliant. Yeah, and just before we continue, I should have said this at the beginning of the meeting, but if anyone who's listening, any member of the audience has any questions they'd like to ask the panel, if you could just use the raise hand function on Teams, and I'll call on you. Professor Bell, one of the areas that the Biden administration will have a lot of leverage to roll back on is in foreign policy. If we could begin with the UK-US relation, especially after Brexit, and finding this trade deal, how is the Biden administration's policy towards Britain going to be different from the Trump administration's?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is difficult. I mean, we don't know what a post-Brexit Britain is yet going to exactly look like, and whether there's going to be a deal, and how far the whole question of trade, even within the British Isles, is exactly going to work is a little bit nebulous still, which of course is really problematic for an incoming administration. And again, for an incoming administration and Congress as well, deals have to be ratified. And I think the difficulty is nobody, I think, in a Biden administration is quite going to get the British decision and what they're doing. And I just don't think there's a sense that this is a viable or workable way forward. And I don't know, and it's going to take a while to work out what a post-Brexit relationship is going to look like. It's just still really unclear, both from as the Biden administration is still taking shape, but also as the British relationship with the European Union is still taking shape. And we still don't know exactly what it's going to look like. Where's even the starting point come January? I just don't know.
Right, and just overall in foreign policy as well, there has been somewhat of a shift, at least in tone, from the Trump administration with previous administrations, both Democratic and Republicans. Dr. Vo, is the Biden administration likely to go back to the usual America leading the world through its military power, through its soft power, or are there lessons to be learned from the Trump administration? What is the overall sort of foreign policy philosophy of the Biden administration likely to look like? I think you're still muted.
Mic's off, Andy.
Sorry, can I just suggest also, Tomaso, that the speakers can also raise their hand, because there's times when, you know, Scott said something and I wanted to jump in and follow up on it, and at the moment we're not able to sort of talk to each other, so we're all the debate's continually going through you and we're not really talking to each other. So if you can let us raise our hands as well.
Yeah, of course.
Putting my hand up now to see, yeah, that works. Yeah. And then that would indicate that we want to come in and talk to each other, because, you know, I disagree with half of what, you know, no, I disagree with 10% of what's been said, and I would have liked to have jumped in and had a little conversation with my colleagues. But okay, so just going back to your question then about an enormous question, you know, how will the Biden administration differ going forwards from both the Trump one and previous Democratic administrations? I mean, I'm not a foreign policy expert. You know, this is not what I spend my days doing. But my overall sense is that the Biden administration, as Scott has already suggested on issues like, you know, the Paris Climate Agreement, will sort of tack back to where the Obama administration was. You know, he's an internationalist. You know, he believes in international institutions. You know, he believes in you know, the efficacy of trade. You know, he thinks that, you know, trade agreements, there can be two winners, whereas Trump's position is, you know, it's a zero-sum game, and if you win, I lose. You know, so that sort of, you know, sort of quite simplistic view of the world will be, you know, put to bed. And I think, you know, the Biden view is pretty close to the Obama view, perhaps with one exception. I think the Democratic Party has perhaps moved on when it comes to China. You know, I think the idea of, you know, sort of integrating China into, you know, the World Trade Organization and free trade generally, there's suggestions that will change. You know, certainly on China and free trade, I think the Democrats, or Biden, sorry, will be sort of tacking more towards Trump's position. But apart from that, you know, and I don't really see much difference from where Obama was. Obviously, you know, you asked the question before about the special relationship, and that, you know, that's a really tough one. There might be a difference, because all of a sudden the UK is not in Europe. We're not a serious player anymore in Europe, and, you know, we can no longer be the voice of America, which we were for a generation. You know, we spoke up for America, we spoke for America in Europe, and that's going to change. And all of a sudden, France and Germany are going to become much more important, and Britain much less important when it comes to that US European relationship. Now, I don't think we ever had a special relationship for two generations. I think now we definitely won't have one, you know, for the next generation.
Right, and just overall, as you were mentioning about China, and there are sort of lessons to be learned also from the Obama administration in China, but also in Russia and the failed so-called reset of the Obama administration. Is there perhaps a certain level of naivete that came with the Obama administration and in their foreign policy that just won't be there with the Biden administration, with the lessons of the Obama administration, but also with just Joe Biden's experience of 40 years in foreign policy? Dr. Lucas.
I think we have to get away from just looking at this or reading in terms of Obama third term, and we've got to realize that the difference here is that whatever you set out to do within your foreign policy, the world isn't necessarily on the same page. And the Obama folks, in effect, were undone by a series of challenges, such as the rise of protest in the Middle East, such as a very aggressive Russian policy, such as the economic challenge from China. such as the ongoing difficulties of how do you extricate yourself from the messes in Iraq and Afghanistan, that meant they were scrambling, to say the least. And I say that as a starting point, which is instead of looking at an overall foreign policy for the Biden folks, start with 2 points and then test it. Start with the first thing that Clodagh referred to, which is the adults are back in the room. The reason why there's not a coherent Trump foreign policy, because Trump is not coherent and because he didn't work with his agencies, he worked against them. So you start with that. Secondly, you look at the point, which is the whole series of cases that have to be dealt with as immediate concerns. And if I can, let me start off with Brexit and say, with respect to you folks, y'all are screwed. You all are screwed. You're screwed if there's a no deal, and you're pretty screwed if there is a deal at the last minute. And I want to be very clear on why that is. And that is that the Johnson government, when it went and tabled the internal market bill in September, which broke international law, which they admitted, they also basically stomped on the relationship, because they had been told since the spring of 2019, when Boris Johnson was trying to become prime minister, they were told by Democrats and Republicans such as Nancy Pelosi, if you jeopardize the security of Ireland, you will not get a UK-US trade agreement. Yet that is precisely what they did in September. I could use another seminar to explain to you why that is such an embedded issue for people in Washington, why they're committed to that line. But let me add to that, it's a trade relationship that you're talking about with the Biden administration. The UK's departure from the EU, with no arrangements at this point for security and intelligence cooperation, absolutely tears up a trilateral relationship between the UK, the US, and the EU. And for example, one reason why the UK is so valued or had a valued relationship with American agencies is because it was America's voice within the European Council. It could represent the American points of view and lobby for the Americans. That is now gone. So the Biden administration will have to deal with that. UK is going to suffer the fallout across the board. With China, for example, you have to respond to the fact that the Chinese have proceeded with the Belt and Road Initiative. They even have Italy on board. How do you respond to that? That means, for example, how you deal with alliances in the Pacific, having had the Trans-Pacific Partnership put to the side. That means how do you rebuild relations with the EU vis-a-vis Asia? How do you deal with the Middle East, for example? And here's a marker for you. When the Obama administration, in the words of Tony Blinken, who's going to be Secretary of State, got it wrong. They got it wrong because they did not protect civilians. Well, there's still opportunity in 2020 to protect civilians, but how do you do it? Afghanistan, how do you proceed with the peace talks or with at least political resolution talks with the Taliban? And we can go around the world and talk about it. I think what I'm saying to you overall is there's going to be no grand speeches like Obama did in 2009, like the Cairo speech, like the Ankara speech. There's going to be a repair relation to rebuild relationships with others. And then you look at what you can do with the cases. But here's the key thing. American foreign policy has been dogged for decades by the idea of the US leads and the rest of the world follows, under Democrats and under Republicans. That world has changed. US leadership is not something that other countries assume. Whether or not the Biden folks realize that and talk about a cooperative multilateralism in which everybody is basically working together, we'll have to wait and see on that one.
Right. Yeah, that's brilliant. And I think now we can sort of move on to Donald Trump's legacy, unless anyone has some final points on sort of the future of Joe Biden, but I'm sure we'll come back to that as well.
Can I just say one really quick thing with my Irish head on, just to follow up on what Scott said there. I attended an online event a couple of weeks ago chaired by Scott's good friend Liam Kennedy at the Clinton Institute in Dublin. And obviously, I mean, Ireland is devastated about Brexit, and, you know, understandably so. It's going to impact them a lot if there's no deal, blah, blah, blah. Could never understand it. All of that caveat in advance. But now things are where they are. And Biden is very strong in his support of Ireland. And it sort of works on two levels, I suppose. One is the kind of that old school soft power that Ireland has. You know, Biden's Secret Service name is Celtic. You know, I mean, Ireland just loves it, loves it, loves it. You know, the village that his grandmother or whatever came from. They've got his picture up everywhere, blah, blah. Now, that's only soft stuff, and it doesn't matter in terms of kind of real consequences. But if you look at the kind of language that Biden used, I think, in around September time, and Pelosi as well, you know, when there was that talk about the, you know, the threats to the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, that went far beyond just, you know, a nod to the Irish American vote to kind of keep them sweet. That was it reminded me of how incredibly significant that the Good Friday Agreement was and still is as a piece of American foreign policy achievement. I mean, obviously it's held as the Holy Grail in Ireland, and everyone thinks Bill Clinton and George Mitchell are, you know, God squared. But, you know, I think in the American annals as well, it has to be remembered how hugely significant that is. And that's a kind of a hard issue, if you like, not just a soft power thing. So there's kind of there's two levels there, and Ireland would never have wished things to be where they are. But now that they are, I think just sort of looking at Britain, and there's quite a strong sense of, you know, WTF from Ireland, going, how did it get to this? You know, that Britain is now so just on the edge of the Atlantic. It's quite staggering, really. So yeah, anyway, that was a bit long-winded, but I just thought I'd add that on to the end of Scott's point. Thank you.
No, yeah, that was brilliant. And if we can, and I'll stay with you, Dr. Harrington, to talk about Donald Trump's legacy, especially within the Republican Party. Over the past 4 years, the Republican Party has really been sort of a cult of personality around Donald Trump. What will happen now that Donald Trump is no longer the leader? Will he still sort of keep this, you know, figurehead role? How can the Republican Party sort of get out of the grips of Donald Trump?
Yeah, I mean, who knows? Who knows? I mean, I suppose there's a couple of things. One is that the party has become his party. I mean, I think there's no question about that. I really remember at the beginning writing about, you know, his kind of his affiliation in the early days. You know, when he was trying to sort of dance with the religious conservatives, for example, and clearly he wasn't a religious conservative himself, but he was trying to speak the language. And in those early days, like even if you looked at his kind of public utterances and that, he talked about them, you know, in terms of, you know, he was trying to please them and he wanted to get the Supreme Court justices for them, etc. And then as time went on, you could see he was starting to kind of own those positions more and more. And I don't mean like he found God or anything like that. I just mean that he found his place, which was a long way away from Manhattan and the kind of the, you know, the stuff that you might associate with New York. He suddenly, or over time, had gone to a kind of a, what I would see as like a Republican base place, if you like. So maybe the kind of the Republican elite were scratching their heads and going, you know, what is this guy up to? But clearly he's reaching out to the masses and maybe the kind of lower level Republican politicians and speaking not only to them, but over time more and more with them and for them. So in terms of what to do with that going forward, I mean, there's all the stuff of, is he going to run in 2024? I mean, he's putting it out there. He's saying he's going to start his campaign on the 20th of January to try and, you know, push the Biden-Harris inauguration, maybe not off the front page, but to be sharing the space with them, if you like, in terms of kind of the airwaves and the column inches. So will that actually happen? Who knows? But I mean, for the time being, you can see how many Republicans have been hedging their bets right up until a few moments ago. I mean, that Supreme Court ruling, which I think was Friday, it was 125 or 126 House Republicans on board with that. I mean, that's only a few days ago. And that's how many people were still going, we're with him, it's a travesty, blah, blah, blah. So I don't really have an answer to the question, but I think it's going to be, it's now a very tangled web. And I don't know how the Republican Party kind of, does it want to step away from Trumpism? Is Trumpism not going to be a thing anymore because the kind of the head's being cut off it? I don't know. I'll defer to my colleagues who I'm sure have sage words to offer.
Dr. Rowe, would you like to jump in here? I'm afraid you're still muted.
Like,
yeah, sorry, I need to stop doing that. It's a really interesting question, and you know, but just sort of in opposition to what Clodagh is saying, there's some sort of logic on the other side that and I'm not saying I believe this, but there are arguments on the other side that Trump will be forgotten pretty quickly. The one of those is that the authoritarian personality, sort of what we call it, disorder that many sort of Republicans have. They worship the leader, but it doesn't matter who the leader is. So if you take away Donald Trump and you put a new leader in his place, the worship will just shift. They will worship the new leader. The king is dead, long live the king, whoever that new king is. So it might be that they're able to move on relatively quickly once Donald Trump is forced from office on the 20th of January. As Clodagh says, he might try and keep himself in the game by saying he's going to run in 2024. I mean, what's really given him the grip on the Republican Party is the fear of elected Republicans of being primaried. So they fear that Donald Trump is going to persuade a candidate to run against them in the Republican primaries, whether that's the Senate primaries or the House primaries or the gubernatorial primaries, whatever it might be. So there's that fear factor there, which keeps them in line. And I think the reason why there was 126, 127 members of the House signed on was because they fear Donald Trump's standing up to them and encouraging someone to run against them. It's how long, for me, what's crucial is how long that fear factor persists. When are members of the Senate and the House and in the states going to feel free, not going to feel scared by Trump? And all that will take will be a couple of instances where he tries to throw his weight around and he fails. I think pretty quickly when he's not president of the United States, his power will just dissipate, and the fear that Republicans have of him will also dissipate, and the Republican Party could quite quickly stop being the party of Donald Trump. I'm not saying I believe what I've just said. I'm just saying there are arguments on the other side.
Right, and I guess the question is what happened if sort of the elected officials are no longer under Trump's grip. What happens to this movement of this grassroots organization that has become passionate over the past 4 years in support of Donald Trump? And I turn to you, Professor Bell. What would happen? What would happen to Trump supporters? Would they go to just remaining to whoever the new leader of the Republican Party is? What would happen?
Well, you're asking the wrong person in a lot of ways, because, if we take what both Andy and Scott have said in terms of what's been happening with the Republican Party just recently, and particularly since the Supreme Court, Mitch McConnell saying that Biden is the president, and there's been a gradual shift as elected Republicans see that they literally can't continue with the blind allegiance to the post-presidency Trump attempt to overturn things. So if we accept that, and Scott made quite a convincing argument, seeing the signs of a Congress, just to take Congress as an example, of moving into the reality of a post-Trump presidency and new tactics and new strategies that will require. Does that mean, the public opinion on the right and Republican voters move along with that? Well, partly we don't know exactly how Trump is going to adapt to a post-January the 20th situation. And again, I can't get into that mindset. It's very difficult for me. So hard for me to give a view on that, really. I can't. But then the same with who are we talking about with Trump followers and Trump supporters? Are we talking about people who have often believed stuff coming out of the tweets and out of the White House and so on, and have accepted it for all sorts of reasons? Are we talking about people who've come out with some really nutty stuff, publicly about, you know, the Democratic victory being a product of the devil, and that there's actual, you know, God has anointed Trump to be leader of the United States. And these are not, there are a lot of these voices, but they're by no means the dominant feature of the American right. So again, it's about whose voices are we privileging, who are we turning to understand what a post-Trump right wing will look like. And there are many people who still voted Republican, or even changed their vote to the Republicans in 2020, in some cases in congressional races and down ticket races, who do not in any way fit that mold of the sort of Trump MAGA image. So it's just complicated, and don't feel at all confident to know where all that's going to pan out.
Right, and if we can just shift to the media landscape that has, you know, that sort of this polarized and partisan media landscape with Fox News as the prime example of it, that sort of started during the Obama years and accelerated during the Trump years. Dr. Lucas, how has the media changed, and what can we expect going forward?
Well, if I could draw from, I mean, all those excellent points, and they were absolutely superb from Clodagh and from Andrew and from Jonathan, and then add the media into this. You know, for me, it's not just that there are two parties now. There's the traditional Republican Party, or the more traditional Republican Party, and then there's the Trumpist. There's now two political systems. And one political system is the system in which Mitch McConnell is operating, which is the political system of Washington, and to some extent, state governments, in which you've got to get things done, or you've got to be effective in preventing the other side from getting things done. So you've got to deal at the level of policy. You've got to deal at the level of day-to-day operations. And that's where McConnell is right now, for example, in talking about the coronavirus relief package, and where he will be after January 20th on a whole range of issues. Now, that system in which you're playing with, the Trumpists are going to be more likely to be in the House, the lower chamber, and Clodagh referred to the fact that 126 of them signed on to that whack job Texas lawsuit that the Supreme Court threw out, because they face a very quick election cycle coming up. They're going to be campaigning again, and they might be thinking a lot of the voters are Trumpies, so I need to appeal to them. Senators have 6-year terms, and if they're not facing an election in 2022, they've got space, and that works more in the system that McConnell's working in. On the other hand, and to add to that, you know, Donald Trump doesn't have any in with the American agencies because they hate him, they despise him. Donald Trump has got no real in with a lot of people in terms of, you know, the traditional way that Washington operates. He might have an in with some state and local parties, again, looking to their own political futures. Where his system is it's in that media landscape, you know, and not even as much the Fox News anymore. If you notice, Trump, in fact, today, his tweets have been aimed at Fox because he doesn't think they're supporting him enough. We're talking about like the Newsmax, Breitbart, One American News, Pajamas Media. These are not news outfits. These are attack sites. These are propaganda sites. Now, as long as they are operating, and as long as we're in this 21st century specter of disinformation and spectacle that Trump has exploited, he still has a play. He has a play when he says, I'm running for president in 2024, and he hopes that the media will all jump onto that. But if a lot of the other media don't give him oxygen, you know, forget the Breitbarts and the One American News Network. Let's talk about the other outlets, you know, the dreaded CNN, NBC, ABC, BS. If they just focus on Biden and they focus on, say, Mitch McConnell, Trump has to have media oxygen to thrive. And remember, there's one other thing on top of this. As soon as he stops being president, he's got a whole shed load of court cases coming down on his head. Because even if Joe Biden holds back, or the Justice Department holds back at the federal level, and even if you know, Trump hopes that his associates are pardoned at the federal level, that doesn't cover state and local cases. And we've heard reference to the Manhattan District Attorney, Cyrus Vance, the New York State Attorney General, Letitia James, who are already lined up with investigations and with cases. So Trump's going to make noise. We know he's going to make noise. We do know that in the most recent poll, 54% of Republicans said they would vote for Trump in 2024. But does he keep getting the oxygen to effectively run, not as a Republican, because he's not a Republican, but as an insurgent who continues to either hold the Republican Party to him in some sense or override them?
Right. Yeah. Brilliant. And I guess this, as you call them, these propaganda sites have also accelerated the polarization in American politics and in the American public. So I'll turn to you, Dr. Rowe. There is this sort of stronger party allegiance than we saw maybe 20 or 30 years ago, and yet there is also consensus at the same time on many policy areas, from gun control to healthcare. How do you reckon these two two bases of the parties seeming as far apart as ever, and yet in public opinion surveys, the media or the public, sorry, being closer than it seems? I'm afraid you're still muted.
Mike.
Yeah, again, sorry. So there's a pretty big debate in academia about polarization and politicization, but the two terms are not synonyms. Often they're used in the same sentence, but they're not the same thing. Polarization refers to an increasing ideological divide, either at the elite level and or at the level of the ordinary citizen. Okay, and there's actually, as you suggest, there's lots of evidence that American citizens are not polarizing, even on hot button issues, perhaps with the exception of abortion, that they're not moving apart. And this is Morris Fiorina's argument that actually, if you look at most issues, including cultural issues, the distribution looks very much like an ordinary bell curve, with very few people at the polls and most people at the centre. At the elite level, I think we do see polarization. So you can look at the DW nominate scores of positions in Congress. We know that Republicans are moving more to the ideological end of the spectrum, to the conservative end. Democrats a little bit, moving left a little bit, but the Republicans really are moving in both the House and the Senate they're becoming more conservative. So there is polarization, I think, at the elite level. But as you said, that's not reflected at the level of the ordinary American voter and citizen. But you don't have to have polarization in order to have politicization. And in fact, politicization can come from a very closely divided country. There's lots of reasons why politics might have become politicized. One of them is that America is now a 50-50 nation, and how do you win in a 50-50 nation? Well, you try and get your base out. You run a base strategy. You try and politicize your voters. In fact, you even try and polarize them to get them out to vote. So I think, yes, we've seen polarization at the elite level. We've not seen it in most cases at the level of the ordinary voter, but we have seen politicization. Yeah, that's absolutely is happening, and maybe because of the media environment, maybe because of a 50-50 nation, maybe because of the effect of primaries over time, deliberate strategies by many people on the right to politicize the Republican Party, or sort of try and move it to the right, beginning with maybe Newt Gingrich, or maybe even Goldwater in the 1960s. You maybe take the story back through history here. So the important thing is, if you're trying to work out what's going on, is not to confuse polarization and politicization. They are different concepts. They are different processes here.
Right, and we just got a question in the chat of who could be a possible replacement as a leader of the Republican Party in a post-Trump era. I'll just open that up to anyone on the panel who has some thoughts.
Right. I'm gonna say not Mike Pence. It just reminded me about a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks after the November election, when things were still not quite up in the air, but not fully settled. I had a guy from Newsweek got in touch with me and said, "Who's the Republican candidate going to be for 2024?" I was like, "Can we not just be in the moment for a little while, please?" But clearly not. So he was doing an article, and we had a fun interaction. And I kind of said, "Okay, so at the moment it's Trump. It can't be it can't really be anyone else until Trump decides what he's doing. So if he decides he's running for 2024, then everyone else, I suppose, just has to kind of stand behind him and look, you know, patient. I think if you look at Mike Pence and his sort of behavior and his kind of self-control, maybe might be the term I might use. Like, he has just kept his side of the street completely clean in relation to Trump the entire time. Whatever one thinks about him and his politics and everything, that's like another story. But, you know, he's never criticized Trump. He's always been, I've always kind of seen him as, you know, the Smithers to Trump's Mr. Burns kind of thing. So like when he comes out post Mr. Burns, that there is nothing, that there's kind of no dirt or unpleasantness to be managed with him. But going back to what Andy was saying a while ago about the, you know, the leader doesn't matter because the worship will shift. I just think, is anyone going to worship Pence? I wouldn't think so. He, you know, he doesn't have the charisma. So, I mean, when I was talking to the Newsweek guy, he was saying, "Oh, what about Don Jr.?" And I was like, you know, it's the Trump brand, but he hasn't got any charisma. So no. Jared Kushner, no. You know, so I'm not sure. There's the kind of the brand recognition people who were kind of associated on Trump's coattails, but it might be that by the time 2024 comes, that there are kind of genuinely desirable and able people in the running that we haven't even considered yet. So that'll be my 2 cents worth, I think.
I mean, remember that in one sense, you don't have a leader of the opposition like you do in this country. What you have is people who are scrambling to eventually become the presidential candidate. So de facto, I think you're talking about someone like a Mitch McConnell, who is the de facto, as it were, leader of the Republican forces in terms of what it is. In terms of who will be positioning themselves to, in effect, be there in 2024. So going beyond the practical of policymaking to actually the electoral, you know, Ted Cruz is going to run in 2024. And Cruz, the interesting thing is that Cruz's base, which is the Tea Party, he eventually lost in 2016 because Trump won over a lot of the Tea Party folks. He did it deceptively. Donald Trump's never really believed in small government. He's just believed in himself. But Cruz will be back. Marco Rubio wants to be back in 2024 and will try to run. But then you've got someone like Nikki Haley, who's the former governor of South Carolina, who stepped out of the Trump administration in 2018. She was the ambassador to the UN to prepare for a run for president. Now, what's she doing that on? That she's the leader of the Republican Party? No, it's going to be on the, you know, let's be honest here. She's a woman. She is from a ethnic minority. She's Indian in descent. She's something different. She has, in a word, tacked on to Trump for a while, but then she's tacked onto the Republican Party at other points. So she will be in the mix. You've got some who I think are more likely to be like Trumpies, like Tom Cotton of Arkansas, the senator, who may try to wear Trump's clothes if Trump doesn't run, or Josh Hawley out of Missouri. In other words, what you have got is not a leader of the Republican Party, but to tack onto the previous question is, you've got a party which really is in search of itself. As much as we talk about the challenges for the Democrats, and they are massive because now you are in power in the White House, you've got a Republican Party which has really lost its identity when Trump came inside the party. And now, more than who is going to lead the Republican Party, what kind of Republican Party do you have immediately? And then in the run up to 2024? That's the question for me.
Right. And yeah, it's fascinating. And as we sort of get towards the end of our time, I just wanted to talk briefly about the legacy of Donald Trump on sort of the democratic institutions in the United States, and especially they have been tested, but maybe not to the fullest. Maybe a more apt wannabe autocrat would have been more able to break them. Professor Bell, what do you think the legacy of the institutions and trust in government is in the U.S. now after the Trump presidency?
Well, we haven't talked much about courts yet in this discussion, and I think that's that is an important legacy that I think a lot of the Republican leadership are very pleased about that they have continued what they started when they began taking huge numbers of control of state legislatures and governorships, as well as the Trump presidency. They've been redistricting, but they've also been appointing lots and lots of people to federal courts, and of course 3 justices to the US Supreme Court now. And I think that will be a very good legacy for the right in the Republican Party, that they feel that was one of the missions of 2016, was to secure that. That was the whole mission behind not having Merrick Garland go anywhere near a Senate committee hearing, and that will be a good outcome in terms of what will be the momentum of constitutional jurisprudence for the foreseeable future. But in terms of the legacy, in terms of government, the hollowing out of many government departments, Scott was referring earlier to how loath Trump is in the various agencies where the capacity of government has been really impeded by just not appointing people, getting rid of people, leaving entire departments without proper staffing. I mean, there's a horrible mess that the Biden administration will have to sort out. But I think that was partly, again, a plan that you destabilize normal institutions of governance, and that allows you as a leader like Trump to fashion a governance around him as a person rather than the institutions of government. And I think that should be undone with reasonably easily by a change of administration. But I think some of the damage in terms of the perception of government will be harder to shift.
Brilliant. Dr. Harrington, would you like to jump in there with this question of sort of the legacy of on the institutions in the U.S.?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about Trump legacy and, the kind of impact of it, consequences of it, all of that kind of thing. And it's very easy to tell a very negative story or a very specific story. Like, Jonathan's points about the Supreme Court is, hugely significant in the sense that, they're there for decades. Trump's gone in a few weeks. Those people could be there for, 30, 40 years. So that's enormously significant. I think in terms of people kind of, possibly feeling a bit depressed or overwhelmed at the impact of the past 4 years, there's certain strands where I've kind of found some positivities, I think, and that would be in relation to when the story is bigger than the person, the individual in the Oval Office. And, I've been thinking a lot about climate change and that, all the damage that Trump has done on that front, all the rollback, there's like more than 100 kind of strands of climate change progress that have rolled back on his watch, which, would make you cry if you cared about the planet. But then you look at, maybe starting with activists and local government, state government, businesses, international organizations, NGOs, the EU, the UN, blah, blah, blah. There's so many layers whereby progress can come and sort of transcend the individual in the Oval Office, no matter how benign or not they might be. I mean, Biden might be benign towards, the climate agenda, etc. But even if it's not him, even if it's, I don't know, Don Jr. in 2024 and he wants to roll stuff back again, the momentum is there. And I think there's something positive to be taken from that you have many, many layers of progress, and that executive is very powerful, very significant, but it is only one. So that's my comfort blanket for me, so I don't get too overwhelmed by everything that's happened in the past 4 years.
Brilliant, yeah. And we're just about running out of time. So if any of the panelists have sort of some concluding remarks or final thoughts that they'd like to say, and just open the floor up to that. Dr. Rowe.
Yeah, just to follow up, I think it's a really interesting question about the legacy. I'm just a shameless plug before we finish, and I co-authored a book called The Ordinary Presidency of Donald J. Trump. And the argument was that basically in policy, I mean, we did write this, 2.5 years ago, but the argument basically was in policy terms, he's not achieved very much. If you look at it, especially real legislative change, he's made some change on, via executive orders, but that's easily overturnable by the next president. And I stick by that argument we made in the book that, he's pretty ordinary in terms of, concrete achievements, and where he has had achievements, they've been, pretty much down the line conservative Republican ones. But when your question about legacy, I mean, actually, sorry, there was recently just appeared a round table in the Journal of American Studies, which Scott used to edit, actually. And Clodagh was one of the contributors to that round table. And, she was frankly putting the boot into our book. And, it deserved the boot being put in. Absolutely. I fully acknowledge that, Clodagh, and I'm really pleased that you did. But, your criticism, one of the criticisms that you made of the book was, we can't ignore his words. We can't ignore his rhetoric. His words and his rhetoric is damaging. And I acknowledge that it is. And, what we've seen over the past 2 months is a president who has determinedly set out to undermine American democracy. In fact, he set out to steal an election, and that's not worked. But in the process, he has undermined American democracy. He's undermined Americans' confidence in their democratic institutions. He has convinced 80% of the Republican Party that Joe Biden actually lost this election and is an illegitimate president. And that is hugely consequential going forward, this undermining of a democratic process. And so in no way is that ordinary. I absolutely fully acknowledge that, Clodagh. And that's what worries me most. That for me, the legacy is a question about, well, has Trump successfully managed to undermine the democratic process? Or, I don't know the answer to this yet, or will the institutions and the separation of powers and the commitment to democracy hold? We don't know. But one thing I think we do know is, at least in the short term, Republicans do not accept that Biden is a legitimate president. And one of the functions of democracy is not only to pick a winner, but it's also to convince the losers that it's the other guy's turn. And that's been undermined, and that really worries me.
I think those are really good points that aren't that far apart, in the sense that Donald Trump was less than ordinary in terms of policy. He got very little through in terms of a policy sense, but in a way, there was a wider battle going on, and it wasn't just Trump. It was someone like Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon came in 2017, and he said, "Look, I'm a Leninist, not John Lennon, the guy from the Soviet Union, Vladimir." He said, "I'm going to tear the whole thing down. We tear the agencies down, we tear the system out, and we build it back up. In other words, we build it back up the way we want to." And that was where we were. That this was an attempt to tear down the American system, with all the disinformation, with all the attacks on civil servants, with all the dismissals, with all the calling of people out onto the streets, even to the extent of storming the Michigan State Capitol. And the American system held. It held, but it was a close-run thing, but it held. Donald Trump did not get the Supreme Court. He didn't pack the Supreme Court to overturn this election, which is exactly what he was trying to do, and said he was going to try to do with the Amy Coney Barrett confirmation. Congress carried water, or at least the Republicans in the Senate carried water for Trump. He should have been impeached and convicted, or he should have been convicted. But at the end of the day, at least Congress is still there. The agencies are still there. But at the same point, we're still at I said before the election, we're at the most dangerous time in American history since 1945. And I still think we are. But that being said, I come back, I think, to the point that Clodagh made, and that is, there are a lot of good people out in America who haven't necessarily gotten the headlines, who don't necessarily get the attention on Twitter, but who want things to be better. And they want it better in a fundamental sense. They want decent health care. They want decent housing. They want economic security. They want jobs. They want their kids to have an education. And I come back to this, that for all the attention that Donald Trump has created, remember that the day after the inauguration, the bigger crowd was the crowd that came out for the Women's March in 2017. Not just on women's issues, but on a wide range of issues. And I come back to the fact that a lot of people came out in 2018 after the Parkland shootings to deal not only with gun control, with a wide range of issues. And people are there. But I think, again, Andrew makes the point, which is you have to reach across to people. You have to reach across to people who might have been drawn in by the us versus them, left versus right, spectacle, and say, no, these issues concern all of us. And that's the real challenge, I think, not just for Joe Biden. It's the challenge for everybody at federal, state and local level. It's the challenge for us as activists. And by the way, not just in the US, but in the UK as well. And that's what gives me hope, but also highlights for me the challenge each and every day as we face an America that is in flux. And will it get back to a stable country? We cross our fingers, but we have to work for it as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a great note to end the event on. I'd like to thank once again all our panelists. This has been a really interesting event, and we could go on talking for hours. But yeah, thank you all so much, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tommaso. Cheers.
Thanks so much, Tommaso, for organizing. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and fellow panelists. Take care, everybody.